The guns had been roaring for so long that silence had become a myth. To Private Edward Callahan, the world beyond the trench was no longer made of sky and trees, but of smoke and thunder. Yet in his breast pocket, wrapped in oilskin to keep it dry, lay a folded scrap of paper, a poem he'd written the night before. He read it in whispers between shell bursts. The mud is kind, it swallows the dead gently. The rain is cruel, it remembers where we fall. He wasn't sure why he still wrote. The others thought it strange to put words to the very thing that crushed them. But for Edward, words were all that separated him from the animal instinct of survival. Writing meant remembering that beauty once existed, that the world had not always been painted in blood. Corporal Reeves, his bunkmate and closest friend, peered over his shoulder. "Another one, Eddie?" he asked, grinning through his grime-covered face. "What's this one called, then?" "Mud Symphony." Edward chuckled softly, tucking the paper away. "Maybe. Or Requiem for Sanity." Reeves laughed, a brittle, half-crazy sound. "You and your poetry. If I make it home, I'm gonna have a pint for every verse you've written." The banter helped. It made the horror smaller, easier to fit inside the day. But when night came, and the flares rose like dying stars above the wire, Edward would see shapes moving in the shadows, the ghosts of men he'd known, faces he'd buried, eyes that still blinked behind closed lids. And he'd write. He wrote about the stench of death, about the rats that grew fat on flesh, about the boys who sang to drown out fear. He wrote about God, and the silence that followed when they called his name. One night, after a raid that left half their unit gone, Edward sat against the trench wall, trembling. His hands were blistered from the recoil of his rifle. The paper before him fluttered in the wind. He dipped his pen in ink that smelled faintly of gun oil and began to write. "The world is drowning in red. And all the poets are blind. We write of courage, when what we mean is fear." A shell landed nearby, shaking the earth. Dirt rained down. Reeves shouted from the dugout, "Eddie! You mad bastard, get down!" But Edward didn't move. The words had to be finished. They were the only thing that still made sense. By morning, the poem was done, smudged, torn, but alive. Like him. When the sun rose weakly over the battlefield, he slipped the poem into an envelope addressed to no one. He didn't know who would ever read it. Maybe no one would. Maybe that was the point. He whispered the title to himself. The Pity of War. And for the first time in weeks, Edward smiled. He had written the truth, and in this place, truth was rarer than life itself.
The poem spread faster than Edward ever expected. He hadn't meant for anyone to see it. But Reeves, ever the mischief maker, had found the page folded under Edward's rations and read it aloud one night in the dugout. The men, filthy and half-mad from shellfire, had listened in stunned silence. When Reeves finished, nobody laughed. Private Larkin, who hadn't spoken a full sentence in days, muttered, "That's it, isn't it? That's what it feels like." After that, copies began to circulate. Smudged in charcoal on scraps of ration paper, memorized in the dark by candlelight, passed like contraband between the broken and the brave. Soldiers would whisper it in foxholes, or murmur the lines before they went over the top. It became a prayer, a curse, and a strange kind of comfort. But comfort was dangerous in the trenches. Hope even more so. One damp morning, a courier arrived with orders from headquarters. Edward was to report to the command post immediately. Reeves clapped him on the shoulder. "You've done it now, poet. They probably think you're stirring up mutiny with your fancy words." Edward gave a small, uneasy smile. "Maybe I am." He followed the courier through the winding trench, past men coughing up mud and blood, until they reached a wooden hut marked Captain Harrington. The officer was a tall man with the posture of someone who believed in order because it was the only thing between him and madness. "Private Callahan," Harrington said, not looking up from his desk. "You've been writing?" "Yes, sir." "Poems?" Edward hesitated. "Yes, sir." The captain slid a crumpled sheet across the desk, one of Edward's verses. This one's been circulating. The men seem to think it speaks to them. Edward's mouth went dry. I only write what I see, sir. Harrington's eyes lifted, sharp, tired, and wary. What you see, Private, can be dangerous. The War Office doesn't want sentimentality. They want heroes, not martyrs. I'm not trying to make martyrs, Edward said quietly. I'm trying to make men remember that they're still human. The captain stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled. You remind me of another fool I once knew. Thought he could write the war into something noble. He didn't last long. Edward said nothing. Harrington leaned back. Keep your poems to yourself. You're a soldier first. Understood? Yes, sir. But when Edward returned to the line, Reeves was waiting with a grin. They try to muzzle you. Something like that. Reeves lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the exhaustion carved into his face. Then you're doing something right. Write another one, Eddie. For us. That night, while the stars flickered faintly through drifting smoke, Edward wrote again, not for command, not for glory, but for the ghosts. If words could heal the dead, I'd write until my hands were bones. But ink can't stop the rain, nor wash the blood from the stones. He folded the page and looked up at the dark, endless sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other poets, Sassoon, Owen, Brooke, might have been doing the same. Writing to prove that even in hell, beauty could survive. Edward whispered to the night, maybe that's our rebellion. And in that moment, amid the ruin of men and mud, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a poet of the damned, and every line he wrote was a quiet defiance against oblivion. By the time Edward's next poem reached the newspapers, he didn't even know it had left the trenches. It began as a rumor, a corporal saying his sister had read The Pity of War in the London Chronicle. Then a newspaper clipping arrived, passed through mud-caked hands like a sacred relic. There it was, printed in neat serif type, surrounded by stories of troop movements and political speeches. The world is drowning in red. And all the poets are blind. The men stared at the page in disbelief. For a brief moment, the war didn't feel infinite. The words had escaped the barbed wire. Reeves slapped Edward on the back. You're famous now, Eddie. The whole bloody country knows about you. Edward didn't smile. Fame, out here, felt like a betrayal. That night, he wrote nothing. For the first time since arriving at the front, the words wouldn't come. He lay awake listening to the rain pound the tin roof, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, the ones back home, safe and warm, reading about that soldier poet. He imagined mothers clipping his verses from the paper, pinning them beside portraits of sons who would never return. He imagined politicians quoting him in speeches about courage and sacrifice, twisting pain into propaganda. The thought made him sick. 2 days later, an officer arrived at the front with orders to escort Edward back to London. He was to assist in morale efforts, reading poetry for fundraisers, writing pieces to inspire enlistment. Reeves watched him pack with a bitter grin. They're making you their mascot now, aren't they? Edward shook his head. I don't want to go. You don't get to want, Eddie. None of us do. The journey to London felt like traveling between worlds. The train carried him from hell into comfort, gas lamps, perfume, laughter. The city was alive, indifferent. Men in fine coats spoke of the war like it was a chess game. At the reading hall, Edward stood before an audience of officers, dignitaries, and wives in silk. They waited for him to glorify what they could never understand. He unfolded a sheet of paper. The silence grew thick. Then, in a steady voice, he began. They say we die for honor. But honor is just a word. We die because the world forgot. That words were meant to heal. The hall went still. Then came the murmurs. Discomfort. Anger. Someone coughed sharply. Afterward, a colonel approached him with a cold smile. You've a gift, Private Callahan. But gifts must serve their purpose. Edward looked him in the eye. Maybe the purpose is to remind you what this war really costs. The colonel's jaw tightened. That's not your place. Edward returned to the front the next week, by his own request. He couldn't stand the velvet rooms, the false cheers, the polite applause. The truth was in the trenches. The truth bled. When he arrived, Reeves hugged him roughly. Couldn't stay away, could you? Edward laughed weakly. Home sweet home. That night, as the guns thundered again, he opened his notebook and wrote. They took my words. But not my voice. And if silence is all that's left, I'll make it sing. He pressed the page into the mud beside him and whispered, for them. For the men who never came back. For those who still dreamed of a sky without smoke. For the poets who would never finish their last line. The winter of 1917 came early that year, hard and merciless. The trenches froze over like graves of ice, and the wounded were buried in frost as much as in earth. Edward's hands had grown raw and bloodless, the ink in his pen thickened like tar. Still, he wrote. Every night. Every moment the guns allowed. He had started a new poem, one that he meant to finish before the next push, before whatever fate waited beyond the wire. It didn't have a title yet. It was just the truth. Reeves limped beside him one morning, the two trudging through knee-deep sludge to deliver rations. The sky was a dull bruise, heavy with snow. You've gone quiet, Reeves said, stamping his boots. That means one of two things, either you're thinking about some grand verse, or you're thinking about dying. Edward smiled faintly. Maybe both. Reeves snorted. Well, if you're gonna die, at least make sure it rhymes. The joke hung in the cold air for a moment before fading into silence. They both knew it wasn't just humor, it was prayer disguised as laughter. Later that evening, word came down, they were to go over the top at dawn. Another push through the mire, another line of enemy fire. Everyone knew what that meant. Edward sat in the dugout, the small candle beside him flickering in the draught. He pulled out his notebook, fingers trembling, and began to write. When the sky splits open. Don't look for me in the mud. I'll be where words still matter. Beyond the reach of guns and blood. The shells began again before he could finish. The ground shook violently. Earth and smoke filled the air as shouts rang out across the trench. Reeves stumbled in, helmet askew, eyes wild. They're hitting the front line, Eddie. We've got to move. Edward stuffed the page into his jacket and grabbed his rifle. The world outside was chaos, explosions tearing the horizon apart, men screaming for medics, flares painting the sky in firelight. They moved together, ducking through the shattered trench wall toward a crater for cover. Then the world turned white. A blast. Deafening. Blinding. When Edward came to, everything was muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in cloth. His ears rang. His legs wouldn't move. He looked down and saw blood soaking through his tunic, warm against the cold. Reeves was shouting, crawling toward him through the smoke. Eddie! Hold on. You hear me? You're not leaving me, damn it. Edward tried to speak, but his throat filled with iron and salt. He reached for his notebook instead. Reeves saw it, the blood-smeared pages, the half-finished poem, and his face twisted with grief. Don't you worry, Reeves said, voice breaking. I'll get it home. I promise. Edward's hand trembled, fingers brushing the air as if trying to grasp one last line. Then he whispered something, too soft to hear. A final verse, maybe. A prayer. The next shell landed just beyond the crater. When the smoke cleared hours later, Reeves was found alive beneath the rubble, concussed, wounded, clutching a torn notebook to his chest. Inside, written in Edward's shaky hand, were the final words. Tell them we were not brave. Tell them we were human. And that was enough. Reeves sent the poem back to London. It was published posthumously under the title The Last Line. It spread like wildfire. Across homes, churches, barracks, mothers read it to the empty chairs at dinner. Teachers recited it to silent classrooms. Soldiers copied it into the margins of their Bibles. The War Office tried to ban it, calling it defeatist. But it was too late. The truth had already escaped the trenches. Years later, after the war ended, Reeves visited a small grave marked Private Edward Callahan, 1895 to 1917. He stood in the cold, hat in hand, as the wind moved through the grass like a whisper. "I kept my promise, mate," he said softly. "They'll remember you." He placed a folded scrap of paper against the headstone, one last poem, written by Reeves himself. "You wrote of war. But we found peace. You died in mud. Yet your words never ceased." And as the sun broke through the fog that morning, the field fell quiet, save for the faint echo of a poet's last words, still drifting somewhere between heaven and earth.